They told us that grief had rules, that love, once lost, must be worn like a uniform, black crepe, silence, and lowered eyes. But what they never said was how long sorrow lingers, how quietly it weaves itself into the hem of your dress, how it becomes part of your breath, your spine, your shadow. Tonight, we step into the quiet world of Victorian mourning, where women were expected not just to grieve, but to make grief beautiful. This is not just a story of loss. It's a story of how women were taught to disappear, one veil at a time. Women in Victorian asylums. They said I was hysterical, not grieving, not angry, not scared or overwhelmed or trapped in a house that never called me by name. No, just hysterical. That's the word they use when they cannot control you. I remember the doctor's face, calm, clinical, void of curiosity, like he was diagnosing a faulty hinge on a gate. He looked at my husband, not at me, and said, "Yes, the wife is unwell. Better to send her before it gets worse." Send, like a parcel or a stain, not a person. I wasn't sick, I was tired. Tired of pretending that obedience was the same as happiness. Tired of being spoken over, handled, corrected, dressed up like a porcelain figure and sat in the same room day after day. Tired of brushing my fingers along the seams in the wallpaper, hoping one might split and open a passageway out. I had spent too many nights by the window, long after the fire died, wondering if the moon ever looked at me the way it used to, when I was still me. But none of that mattered once I stopped pretending to be fine. That was the real transgression. The moment I said no. The moment I raised my voice just once. The moment I didn't take his hand at dinner. That was when the walls began to rise around me. They didn't call it punishment. They called it care. I arrived at the asylum on a damp Thursday, wearing my second-best shoes and the coat with lavender sachets still stitched into the lining. I remember the wet stone beneath my feet, the smell of bleach and wilted roses, the matron's eyes, measuring, already deciding what sort of woman I was. I thought perhaps there would be mercy, but mercy is not welcome in such places. Mercy would ask questions. Mercy would hesitate, and this place was built for swift, silent correction. The women there, they didn't scream. Not the way I had imagined. Most were quiet, dreadfully so. The kind of quiet that sinks into the walls and makes them feel padded, even if they aren't. Some stared at nothing. Some rocked gently to some lullaby only they remembered. Others blinked against sunlight like it was too bright for the half-life they'd been given. One girl, Clara, I think her name was, curled into herself like a dying star. They said she read too much poetry, that her father caught her reciting Byron aloud and feared it had infected her. I remember thinking, I was that girl once. I too loved words. I too dared to feel too much. There were no clocks here, just routines. You woke when they woke you. You ate when they rang the bell. You bathed when they said you were unclean. And sometimes they said it just to remind you who had the power. I was called Miss Bell. I hadn't used that name in years, but married women weren't seen as patients. They were property, returned to be repaired. We were not treated. We were managed. Sometimes they bled us, leeches or little cuts, like they believed sadness lived in our veins. Sometimes they burned herbs under our noses. Sometimes they pressed cold metal to our skin, waiting for screams that never came. But the worst was the rest cure. Hours, days, confined to bed. No books, no writing, no visitors, no sound. Just stillness, as if by lying still long enough, grief might fold itself back inside. But stillness only taught us how to disappear. When your voice has nowhere to go, it starts curling inward like smoke trapped in a jar. You begin to doubt its shape, its reason, its right to exist at all. At night, I dreamed of my sister, of her laughter, loud and ringing, the way it once filled the garden in spring. I wondered if she remembered me. I wondered if she had also been warned to stop smiling too much, feeling too much, thinking too loud. I used to imagine someone coming, even my husband, ashamed, regretful. Maybe he would see the hollow space where I had once stood and miss me. But no one came, and eventually I stopped watching the door. What they never say is that many of us were not ill, just inconvenient, too bold, too full of questions, too unwilling to sit still and smile. Some had lost children and cried too long. Some refused to lie beneath husbands they no longer loved. Some heard music in silence. Some simply dared to walk alone after sunset. And yes, some truly suffered. But even suffering deserves gentleness. And here, gentleness was rare. We weren't allowed mirrors. They said it bred vanity or delusion, but I think it's because they didn't want us to see what they had turned us into. Still, near my bed, there was a crack in the window. And when the morning light angled just right, I could glimpse myself in the fractured pane. I didn't look mad. I looked like someone trying not to vanish. One night, I wrote my name into my palm with my fingernail, over and over, just to remember what it felt like to be. They caught me, and that was the end of speaking. They moved me to the quiet ward. There they whispered. They drugged the tea. They taught us to smile in our sleep, soft voices, soft sheets, soft hands, soft minds. That was the goal, to soften us until we disappeared inside the shell they left behind. I dreamed of walking on grass, barefoot, unafraid. I dreamed of someone saying, "You were right to be angry." But I always woke up beneath the same ceiling. Eventually, the days slipped from my hands, then the weeks, then the years. But I never forgot the why. I was here because I dared to feel too much and to let it show. And in a world that prizes silence over truth, that was the greatest heresy. They didn't break us by accident. They broke us carefully, methodically, with the language of care. They didn't kill us. They quieted us until we whispered apologies even in our dreams. There is a particular kind of cruelty that masquerades as kindness. And in places like this, it is stitched into every wall, every spoon, every bed. Sometimes they let us walk the garden paths, under supervision, of course. I watched the birds the most. No one ever told them to hush. No one ever clipped their wings for flying too far. If someone finds this page, folded behind this loose stone near the corner of the east wall, I hope they understand. We were not broken. We were not insane. We were simply too much, too loud, too alive, and they could not bear the sound of us. They didn't lock us up because we were broken. They locked us up because we wouldn't break quietly. Victorian wives and marital duty, they said I was lucky. A good match, they whispered. He's stable, respected, he'll provide, and he did. There was food on the table, wood in the fireplace, coin in the drawer, but no one ever asked what it meant to be fed and still feel empty. The morning after the wedding, I woke up before him. I watched his shoulders rise and fall in steady breath while mine barely moved. Something had changed, and I couldn't name it. But I knew I didn't belong to myself anymore. They called it duty. I called it vanishing. There was no violence, no shouting. He never raised a hand, but he never lowered his voice to ask what I wanted either, because wanting for a wife was never part of the arrangement. In the early days, I learned quickly how to serve tea at the right temperature, how to match my silences to the length of his mood, how to dress in a way that said, "I am respectable, but never I am seen." And at night, I learned what it meant to close your eyes and open your body, to pretend that submission was affection, to lie still and be called devoted. They never tell you that being a wife is a job, an unpaid one, a performance, rehearsed daily until you forget where the stage ends. I had a schedule, a rhythm: wake, cook, dust, mend, smile, obey. And if I strayed from it, if dinner was too cold or I looked too tired, there were consequences. Not bruises, no, something colder. A withdrawn gaze, a long silence, a statement said just loudly enough for the maid to hear. Some wives forget how fortunate they are. Fortunate. That word felt like a chain wrapped in velvet. I tried in the beginning to find comfort in the little things, fresh lavender under the pillow, the sound of birds before dawn, the weight of a book in my lap when the house was quiet. But the lavender faded, the birds came and went, and the books, well, even they began to feel heavy with stories of women who never quite found their way out. I envied the servants sometimes. Not their work, but their freedom to leave at the end of the day, to step outside and become someone else. But I was always a wife, even alone, even in the bath with the door locked and the mirror fogged. One evening, he brought a guest to dinner, a colleague from the city. The conversation was full of politics and trade and laughter that didn't need my voice. But then the guest turned to me and said, "And what do you do with your days, Mrs. Halston?" I froze. No one had asked me that in years. "I keep the house," I replied. I smiled politely, but inside I wanted to scream. I breathe quietly. I disappear efficiently. I swallow my thoughts before they touch air. That night, after the guest had gone and the dishes had cooled, I sat in the dark parlor and wondered what it would feel like to be asked again, to be seen not as a wife or a hostess or a body or a bodied, but as a mind, a soul. But that wasn't my role. My role was to be still, sweet, silent. Marital duty, they called it. But duty is something done with purpose. This felt more like erosion. There were no anniversaries for survival. No praise for never breaking. Only the quiet ticking of days and the expectation that I'd always be ready to serve. Even my own body became something I lent. He'd enter me like a room he owned. No need to knock. No need to thank. I learned to dissociate, to float above myself and count ceiling cracks while he finished, to imagine rivers and open fields and women running barefoot into the dusk. In those moments, I was somewhere else. Not his, not theirs, not anyone's. They warned us girls that marriage was serious, sacred, but no one warned us it could be so lonely. Sometimes I wondered if I was broken, if other wives felt the same way. But I couldn't ask. That would be unbecoming, indecent. I tried once. I asked a neighbor, gently, whether she ever found it hard. She looked at me, smiled softly, and said, "We do what we must, and thank God for the roof over our heads." That was the last time I asked. So I folded myself smaller. I smiled at the right moments. I kissed him goodnight, and I tucked my sadness under the mattress where he'd never look. The years passed. We had no children. He never asked why. And I never offered the truth that I had once, and I had not kept it. I buried that memory like I buried so many things. And each time I looked in the mirror, I searched for the girl I used to be. She was fading. Now and then I would write in secret. Small scraps, nothing grand, just lines like, "Today I made it through without weeping." He touched my shoulder and I didn't flinch. I miss wanting. I kept them in a box behind the floorboard, like evidence that I once had thoughts of my own. If you are reading this, maybe you found them. Maybe you wonder why a wife would hide her truth. But in this world, truth is dangerous for women like me. Not because it is wrong, but because it doesn't fit the mold. We were told to be good, to be gentle, to serve. But I was never told how to live with a heart that beats louder than silence allows. She wasn't unloved, she was unheard. And in that silence, she vanished, one yes at a time. Schoolgirls and governess to Miss Howard, whom I never truly thanked. I was 12 when Miss Howard came into our house, tall, serious, and wrapped in the scent of ink and starch. Father introduced her simply, "This is your new governess. You will mind her. That is all." He didn't say where she came from. He didn't say what had happened to the last one. But I remembered the last one cried behind her book and smelled faintly of sherry. Miss Howard didn't either. She wore her hair in a tight knot. Her shoes were always polished. Her hands were always stained, just slightly with ink. She did not smile easily, but she listened. And that, I would come to understand, was far more valuable. Each morning, I sat with her in the small schoolroom on the 3rd floor, a quiet space with slanted windows, walls lined with books, and the faint scratching of pencil on slate. We read Latin, recited The Tempest, parsed moral essays from Fordyce's sermons, though I always suspected she loathed them. Once, as I stumbled through a passage about the natural modesty of the female mind, she paused me mid-sentence. "Do you believe that?" she asked, not looking at the page, not at the ceiling, but at me. I blinked. No one had ever asked me what I believed. "I suppose I must," I replied. She gave a small nod, then gently said, "Supposition is not the same as truth." That day, I underlined that line in my mind. I have never forgotten it. Miss Howard taught me how to write essays, how to distinguish between Cicero and Seneca, how to read a room before I entered it. But more than that, she taught me how to think without apology. For a girl of 13, that was revolutionary. Of course, Mother did not approve. She found Miss Howard too reserved, too plain, too forward in her opinions. But my father liked her discipline and quiet efficiency, and that was enough to keep her in the house. What they didn't see was the cost. Governesses lived in limbo. Too educated to belong with the servants, too low-born to dine with the family, she took her meals alone. She spent her evenings alone. She existed in the quiet margins of our life, present, essential, but always apart. And yet, she never once complained. She had a way of holding herself like she carried something precious inside, something no one had the right to touch. Once, when I dared to ask if she ever wished to marry, she looked at me for a long moment before answering, "Some women aren't meant to be possessions, my dear." Then she turned back to her mending and said no more. I don't think I understood what she meant until much later. The other girls at school, daughters of dukes and bankers and officers, used to whisper about their governesses in bored, cruel tones. "She's a spinster. She came from nothing. She weeps when she thinks no one's looking." But I never spoke of Miss Howard that way, because while their governesses seemed bent beneath the weight of quiet shame, Miss Howard stood straight, as if the world's disregard had hardened into armor. I once asked where she had learned Greek. "In a library I was not allowed to enter," she said. "How did you get in?" "I found the key." It wasn't until years later that I realized she meant it metaphorically. Miss Howard had taught herself what no one had given her permission to know. In that way, she was the most radical person I had ever met. Still, it was not easy. Being a governess was a life of shadows. No wealth, no protection, no lasting place. If the family liked you, you might stay. If the child misbehaved, you were blamed. If you were too pretty, the wife grew suspicious. If you were too smart, the husband grew nervous. It was a life balanced on a pinhead. One evening, I saw her crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just one hand pressed over her mouth, her shoulders shaking in silence. She sat alone in the garden behind the schoolroom wing, in the shadow of a lilac tree. I didn't call out to her. I simply sat beside her on the cold stone wall and waited. After a time, she whispered, "You will leave this place one day, but I never will." I didn't know what to say, so I held her hand, awkwardly like a child does, and she didn't pull away. That was the first time I realized that grown women could be lonely. As I grew older, our lessons became debates. She gave me Rousseau and let me rip him to pieces. She let me question the Psalms, the rules of courtship, even the idea of heaven. But she also taught me discretion, that a clever woman needn't shout, only know when to speak and when to wait. That is a skill I carry to this day. She left the year I turned 16. There was no scandal, only a new baby, my youngest brother, and mother's decision that I was to be finished, with a Parisian tutor more suited to a lady of marriageable age. I wrote her letters, many, only 2 were answered. "My dear girl," one read, "the world will never ask you what you think. You must learn to tell it anyway." The second ended with no signature, only, "Yours in knowledge and in rebellion." Then nothing. I married, not badly, not well. A man with money, manners, and a need for a wife who knew when to hold her tongue. Miss Howard had taught me both, and I used them like tools. But some nights, when the house is still and the children sleep and the fire dies low, I think of that cold stone wall in the garden and her hand in mine. Years passed. And then one day I saw her name in a notice. Miss Eliza Howard, died at 61, former governess. No family listed, no accolades, just a date, a line, a life reduced to occupation and age. I cried. I cried harder than I did when my mother passed, because Miss Howard had saved me, not with grand gestures, but with quiet truths, and I had never said thank you. So this is my thank you, to the woman who taught me to think, to question, to endure, to the governess who refused to disappear even as the world tried to make her invisible. If you, dear listener, ever wondered what became of all the women like her, know this: they lived in the margins, but they wrote in our minds. They planted seeds no husband could burn, no preacher could silence, and though their names may fade from record books, they live in the strength we carry, in the words we dare to write, in the questions we no longer fear to ask. She taught me Latin, yes, but more importantly, she taught me how to look the world in the eye and not flinch. Death, mourning, and the female rituals of grief. To grieve as a woman meant to vanish into shadow but still be watched. There was a time I wore nothing but black, not because I liked the color, but because it was required of me, expected, prescribed. A widow in 1862 did not merely mourn, she performed mourning. There were stages, you see. Like acts in a silent play no one applauded. First came deep mourning, full black, no trimming, no jewelry except jet, no music, no laughter, no visits, no light beyond candle and prayer. Then came second mourning, still black but a softer fabric, a tiny brooch perhaps, a whisper of lace at the wrist. And finally, half mourning, gray, lavender, mauve, the colors of dusk, the colors of returning slowly to the living. I followed every rule because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. My husband died on a Tuesday. I remember because the clock in the hallway had stopped at 3:11 p.m., and I never wound it again. He hadn't been cruel. He hadn't been kind. He had simply been a presence in the house, a name on the letters, a man I shared meals and silences with. When they lowered him into the earth, I felt nothing. Not numbness, not despair, just emptiness, like someone had pulled the furniture out of a room and left only the wallpaper. But grief in our world wasn't about feeling, it was about showing. So I put on the widow's weeds, heavy black crepe, a veil so thick it muffled my breath, gloves like funeral masks for my hands. I didn't choose them, I was them. Every morning, I dressed as death's echo and moved through the world as a ghost among the breathing. The neighbors praised me, said I was dignified in grief, said I wore sorrow beautifully, as if that were the point. What they didn't see, what they never asked, was how it felt to live inside mourning, to drink tea without sound, to cover the mirrors with dark cloth so the dead wouldn't see you living, to comb your hair and wonder if it mattered anymore. My sister, Margaret, visited once. She hadn't worn black in years. Her husband had died young, and she had refused to wear mourning more than 6 months. They called her indecent. She didn't grieve properly, they whispered, as if grief were a recipe and she had forgotten the salt. But Margaret had always been braver than I. She looked at me, buried under veils and silence, and said, "You don't owe them this, you know." I smiled. Because I did. I owed them everything. The grief they could recognize, the grief they could measure, the grief that looked like what they'd been taught to expect from a respectable woman. Because anything else, anything real, would have scared them. I wore a locket during that time. Black enamel, small, heart-shaped. Inside, a curl of his hair pressed flat and pinned with a tiny golden wire. Mourning jewelry, they called it. Not sentimental, but sanctioned. A way to carry your dead without making others uncomfortable. Some women wore brooches made from entire braids of hair, curled into floral patterns, tucked behind glass, framed in gold. A garden of loss. Others embroidered samplers with names and dates, their sorrow stitched into every loop and knot. We made grief decorative, palatable, something you could hold in your hand and say, "See, I loved, I lost, I'm doing it correctly." Sometimes I visited the cemetery, not to speak to him, I had long since run out of words, but because it was the only place I could sit in silence without being judged for it. There, among the tombs and angels, I was simply another figure in black. No one asked me to smile. No one told me to move on. No one called me strong. They let me be empty. And I was grateful for that. But time has its own agenda. And eventually, even mourning grows stale in the eyes of others. By the end of the second year, I noticed the looks, the sighs, the not-so-subtle hints that perhaps it was time to put away the veil, to wear a bit of lavender, to return to life. But which life? The one I had before? The one I had built entirely around being his wife? There was no return from this. Only forward, into a space I had no map for. I remember the first time I wore color again. It was barely pink, more of a dusty rose. A ribbon on my bonnet, nothing more. But as I passed the baker's shop, Mrs. Hartley looked me up and down and said, "Ah, so the mourning is done then," as if grief could be folded up and packed away with last winter's gloves. That night, I wept. Not for him, but for myself, for the woman who had followed all the rules and still felt adrift. Grief, I came to understand, is not a costume. It is a country, one you do not leave by choice, but by slow forgetting. And even then, something of it clings to you. A shadow in your voice, a softness in the way you touch the world. There were other deaths, of course. A child I never held. A friend who vanished into the asylum and never came out. Each one taught me that mourning was not a singular act. It was a lifelong rhythm. One step forward, two back, a breath, a pause, a memory you didn't mean to carry, but still do. Now I am old, and the black I wear is not for show, but because I have grown into its shape. It fits me like a second skin, like the hushed echo of a church, like the inside of a locket pressed close to the chest. People call me elegant now. They say she's so composed, so wise. But what they're seeing isn't composure, it's layers of years, of losses, of names whispered once and never spoken again. I still keep the locket, And when the house is quiet and the fire burns low, I open it and look at that curl of hair. So small, so absurdly human. Proof that he lived, and that I did too, even when I wasn't sure it counted. If you're listening to this and you've lost someone, know this. There is no correct way to grieve. No ribbon or veil or color that can contain what it means to miss. They told us as women that mourning made us noble, but really it made us invisible. We became statues draped in crepe, symbols of loss, but not people in pain. So I give you permission, the one I never gave myself, to laugh too soon, to cry too late, to carry their name in a locket or in your lungs, to remember, to be messy and honest and human, to mourn in your own damn time. Because grief does not need to be beautiful, it only needs to be true. End of story. She wore black, not to honor the dead, but to remind the living that love, once felt, never truly vanishes. They said mourning would pass, that one day the black would fade, the heart would heal, and silence would lift. But for so many women, grief became a second skin, not just for the husbands they buried, but for the parts of themselves they were never allowed to show. We remember them, not because their names are etched in history, but because they taught us that sorrow speaks, even when the world demands silence. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we must keep listening. Until next time, sleep slow and carry their memory softly.